Ashish, welcome to our AI 360 podcast. Great to have you here.
Jim, thank you for having me. I'm sure it's going to be a fun conversation like it always is.
Like it always is. So you and I only spend, a little bit of time talking to each other, being sarcastic. So Ashish, why don't you tell us a little bit about your role and then people understand why we spend so much time together?
It's a good thing we do. I think this is a lesson in as to why we spend so much time together. I'm a principal at Deloitte. I'm also the US Chief Data Analytics Officer. So all things that, feed our ambition for AI and Gen AI start sort of with data. And lots of reasons why we collaborate for that very reason, and looking forward to the dialogue.
Yeah, it's great. I don't know how we're going to fit this into 360 seconds. So we'll see if this becomes a long form podcast when we're done. But Ashish, I mean, data plays a critical role in everything we're doing from AI. Maybe you could just start telling us a little bit about like where you've been with Deloitte on this journey, because we've had to do a lot, I think, to kind of get ourselves ready for an AI journey internally and externally with our clients.
Yeah, what I'll tell you, the one of the things that became evident to me as we started this was that, our legacy or our data strategy historically was tied to, our own data, right? And if you looked at sort of how we instantiated the data upstream, it came from process-centric software. Any ERP instantiated data, we curated the data, and we sort of said, okay, meets our ambitions. The minute we started to look at sort of agentic AI and Gen AI workloads, it became evident that, first-party data sets alone would not meet the mandate for the use cases that we're curating. So pretty soon we started to look at not just first-party, second-party, third-party, and we do buy a decent amount of third-party and obviously synthetic, right? So longitudinal data sets and things that we could not sort of find irrespective of what we bought and how much of what we bought. So the challenge really became is it's coming as a fire hose now, right? And it's coming from outside the walls of Deloitte. And so how do we put a process in place from the standpoint of the fact that the use case is commensurate with the ambitions, right? Like, so, if we need first party, second party, third party data curated or commingled or vectorized or any of the above, how do we make sure that the process doesn't become an impediment to the SLA or the use case, right? So we have to put a process in place, and we've held to the strategy of being able to procure within the timelines of sort of the needs of the use case, right? And it's down to almost, less than a week in certain cases, and we standardize sort of the terms and conditions with our data broker. So I would say, right, like for me, the biggest revelation, when I started this a year and a half ago was like, how do we do this at scale and a pace that's sort of, commensurate with, how fast things are happening.
Well, and maybe pick up on the speed for a second, because this foundation with the strategy you've set up really helps us enable our internal transformation. So you and I are both also working on figuring out how does the firm improve with the use of AI. It's a great story for what we're doing. It helps with our clients. What do you think the role is of the chief data analytics officer in that type of transformation?
AI has become so core to what we do, right? I mean, we talk about this all the time, right? Like, so if you look at our business value chain, right, it starts with, what we sense in the market and how do we feed that, what's happening in the market to sort of our marketing function that then works with, our operating portfolios and things that sort of stitch together, what services we prepare on the back of what's transpiring, right? And then ecosystem partners are core to sort of this evolution, and all of the supply and demand management that we do in this business value chain is tied to sort of a portfolio of services. And in reality, if you look at, something as nuanced as how do we staff 177,000 people in the US or 455,000 people globally to a role description, there's no contextuality in sort of resumes, right? You have a human being read a resume and feed a role, right? So we figured that, discovery, contextual search, right, like embedded into sort of what we do with our own enterprise data is very, very key to how we go from here to sort of the ambition, right? So we basically took our entire resume database, we contextualized it so you can sort of do search on it, much like you would do on the World Wide Web, but with the UI UX prompt, right? You can get to the nuances of what you're looking for. And those are the kinds of pillars and things that we're standing up that's, on our enterprise data set that sort of make this discoverable, make the things that we intend to do, super cool, or, depending upon your perspective of how much you like technology, yesterday's problem as well as today's problem.
Well, and it's usually one of the things I hear a lot from our clients is, I don't have a data strategy. My data is federated across all these different platforms. I'm multi-cloud, multi-different sources of data everywhere. Can I even get started with AI with my data estate being in that kind of or maybe disarray is a strong word, but that level of organization. Like, what's your perspective? What's your advice to folks on that?
Look, what I would say in essence is, it's never too late to start, right? And in the ambition, your ambition for your business partners is fairly commensurate with where we've ended up, right? There is not going to be a single nuanced of a workload that is not going to be agentic or, enabled by an LLM, or, you pick your choice of sort of disruptive technology, right? So the question really becomes is what's the starting point, right? What's the starting point of this journey? And the starting point of this journey really is think beyond the four walls of where your data is going to come from. Think about annotation and labeling consistent with usage criteria, right? And walk backwards, right? If you walk backwards from the end, you pretty much know sort of what you need to land with. That means you need to be able to procure all flavors of data, like I said, and make sure that the compute environments that are attached to sort of, we run a data marketplace, as you're aware, right? Which is a single landing point for anything that you want. It's called data.deloitte.com, and you land there and you can pretty much search for what you need, right? And that sort of is the first pillar of discoverability, with sort of the nuances of the workloads and the business partners and the use case aspirations. And that's the journey you're going to have to undertake. And it's never too late.
I'm glad to hear it's not too late. I mean, it sounds like you can start small with sort of a focused area of a couple of data products that feed your AI solution, and then build and scale around that. Is that a fair summary?
That is absolutely a fair summary, right? Because if you look at the domains that you start to curate, right, like some function, whether it's finance or marketing or supply chain or, whatever it may be a little ahead of the journey, but nonetheless, right, you can start with the domain and then scale out the patterns depending upon physicalizing the patterns, depending upon what comes next.
I love it. Maybe I could sneak in one last question for you. The technology landscape is vast in this space. There's tons of new capabilities that are coming out from established players. There's startups that are releasing new capabilities. As you sit sort of on top of this view, how are you thinking about like navigating that landscape, some of the build versus buy decisions? How do you think through that? What advice would you give folks?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is it is very, very nuanced and overwhelming to be able to capture all of it, right? And the pace of change or the shelf life of anything that you have, whether it's a feature function set in a model or whatever it may be, is overwhelming to be able to keep up, right? So give yourself some grace. And I don't think that anything that you buy today is going to have the shelf life that you can imagine, right? So the question really becomes is, what are the patterns that you persist, right? And if you understand the patterns that you need to persist, it doesn't make a difference, because interoperability or swapping things out is going to inherently be part of your architecture, right? So whether you pick a particular model or you don't pick a particular model, I think there's certain curation patterns for this data set that should be obvious to you.
I love it. Ashish, great advice. Really appreciate the time today. Clearly, there's plenty of things we could cover longer form later. So hopefully people tune into the things you're releasing online, your LinkedIn as well. You get some great insights about what we're doing around AI and data. Really appreciate the time today.
Thank you, Jim. Take care.
Take care.